I would guess that it was about 1968, when I was a graduate student, that I first became aware of the Aspen Center for Physics. There was a notice posted on a bulletin board, and two of the professors where I was going to graduate school had been participants out here. And I asked them about that, about whether graduate students would be welcome, and they said, well, it doesn't hurt to apply. So I wrote a letter applying, and I got a really nice letter back saying I was admitted, which really thrilled me. And then I read the next sentence, which said, but we're sorry we don't have the budget to support you in your travel and your housing. So I had to really think hard about whether I could afford to come out to Aspen, which already had a reputation as being a real tourist place. I mean, it was a place which I thought would be too expensive for me, and I regretfully decided that I really couldn't. Later on, my husband Randy and I were talking about that, and it turns out that he was in charge of admissions in the late 60s, so the letter was probably from him. I didn't keep it. My first visit to Aspen then was in the summer of 1971, having been married in the fall of 1970. And Randy, of course, was quite involved with the Physics Center. And he, besides that, had his 3 sons during the summer, and so I was going to get my first prolonged experience of being a stepmother when I came out here. We were renting a house at the corner of North and Fourth, owned by the Detlefsen family, and they were letting it run down. But it was a big enough house to accommodate a family very happily, and I didn't worry about the boys running around in the house because it was obviously about to be redone, and it was redone a couple of years later. When we drove up to the house and got out of the car, this woman on a bicycle was driving down 4th Street, and she saw the car, and she swerved to turn into North Street to stop and say hello to us, and her bike tipped over because the roads weren't paved. There was a lot of gravel on them, and was terribly embarrassed. It turned out it was Margaret Gelman, and all of Randy's friends had found out that he had married this child bride physicist, and they were so anxious to find out what I was like. And I felt very, very, very welcomed by all of the old-timers in 1971. Over the years, the contribution that the Physics Center made to my professional career, professional life, were just really substantial. I remember that either the first or second summer I was here, I was talking about basically my thesis work and some work I had done afterward with a professor from Yale, whose wife was also a physicist. But he was really going at me, arguing about something, and we were just going at it about which interpretation was right. And at some point, this was at a party, at some point he walked over to where Randy was standing, and he said, "Do you think I'm offending Bernice by arguing with her?" And I was just thrilled that somebody was really paying attention to my work and taking it very seriously. I also had one randomly assigned office mate who was an Irish theorist, Lachlan O'Rafferty. He had a wonderful name. And we had numerous discussions one summer and wound up co-authoring a paper, and I was again thrilled to be co-authoring a paper with a senior physicist. So over the years, there were some collaborations that formed here. It wasn't as easy to maintain them during the school year as it is now because we didn't have the sort of email connections that we have now. But some nice collaborations formed. And ultimately, I wound up organizing 2 workshops. One of them was a bunch of mathematicians who had gotten interested in the way that physicists use algebras. And I invited a lot of mathematicians and some physicists to come to the Physics Center. They were enthralled by it. There were some great names in mathematics who came. And the physicists and mathematicians had sort of joint seminars on how we used their math, and then they told us about things that they could think of that had to do with their math. It's kind of hard to explain it to a lay audience, but that was, again, another thrilling experience to be able to put together a conference that had great mathematicians whose work I admired and host them at the Aspen Center for Physics. They liked the idea of the Physics Center so much that they came back some other summers, and then they started their own summer institute, not in Aspen. Another workshop that I organized was when I was working at Los Alamos on and off rather frequently. And Pete Carruthers, who was also a member and trustee here and a longtime participant, was the head of the theory group at Los Alamos. And Ina Sharchevich, who was a graduate student at Minnesota, and I'm a professor at Wisconsin, and I had met and hit it off, and I more or less co-directed or directed her thesis work. So it was my first collaboration with a woman. And then she had a postdoctoral position at Los Alamos with Pete Carruthers. And the three of us wanted to have a workshop, so Pete and I co-organized it, and Ina helped out with it. And that workshop, I remember, did not go as smoothly as the one with the mathematicians. The mathematicians were just so happy to be here, and they're very mellow. And some physicists didn't show up, and some of them wanted to talk, and we didn't really want to have talks all the time. So I was actually quite happy to have a co-organizer for that workshop, because it took some of the heat off me in trying to smooth the waters for the workshop. I've been on various committees. One of them was the library committee, another was buildings and grounds, and one of the things that I appreciated when I was on buildings and grounds was that when I needed to order furniture, I went over to the Aspen Institute, and King Woodward, who's called Woody, was the person who sort of took care of the physical plant at the Institute. That's how I saw him. I mean, he was the person, he was the guru of the irrigation ditches. And I borrowed some catalogs from him of office furniture and asked his advice on buying it, and he really helped me with that. I don't remember whether I was ever on the admissions committee, but in 1974, the admissions committee met in Wisconsin in the new house that Randy and I had just built there. And I remember that Heinz Pagels came, and that Peter Kaus, I think, was the chair of the admissions committee, and he came from Riverside, California. And when Peter got to our house, they actually all spent the night there. They all stayed over, and we worked until late at night and got up and worked early in the morning. When Peter got in the door, he was wearing a raincoat, and he had big pockets in the raincoat, and he started pulling out oranges from the grove that they had in Riverside. And Peter, and Randy told me later that Peter always traveled with his pockets full of fresh oranges to give to people wherever he was visiting. The admissions committee always gathers somewhere and just sequesters itself practically in order to sort through the hundreds and hundreds of admissions. We have about 500 participants now, and at least twice that many will usually apply. So you have to sort through and balance who's going to be coming. It's a complex process. Sometimes they meet in the home city of the chair of the committee. Sometimes they meet in Aspen. But it just happened that the one time that I ever got to meet with the admission, that was not true. I got to meet with the admissions committee twice. Once was in our home, and then once was when I was at Los Alamos, and we met there to do the sorting. Another job that I had as part of the governance of the Physics Center was the corporate lab relationships. There were several corporations which used to sponsor basic physics research, and they would send theoretical physicists to the Physics Center in the summers. And then there were the national laboratories, Fermilab, Argonne National Laboratory, Los Alamos, and they had their ways of being able to sponsor things at the Physics Center, which helped us financially, but somebody needed to make contact with them. And when I was doing corporate and laboratory contributions, it was in its waning days because the big corporations stopped funding as much basic research. They just didn't feel they could put money into basic research. And so one by one they were sort of fading out. And then I remember that Argonne National Laboratory was always faithful, and I think that they were the very last ones to, maybe they still contribute, I don't know, I haven't been doing that. But one of the things that a national laboratory did that contributed to us, which was not just giving us money, was that Fermilab helped us when we brought over Russians. There was a period of, maybe 10 to 15 years when we had Soviet physicists visiting. Nick DeWolf sponsored the travel for the Soviet physicists. And there was one visit by Soviets where I got really involved in it. I essentially co-organized it. A professor at Minnesota, Larry McLaren, was the one who invited the scientists. And then my job was to be the liaison with Fermilab to figure out how to do a visit by Soviets. And they were extremely helpful because we had to deal with the State Department. We had to buy health insurance for them while they were here. I had to get all their travel arrangements. I got all of that done, and Larry got all the arrangements made, and Sally got all the housing arrangements made, and we were here, and the Soviet entourage came to Aspen. And one of the things that they did just about every day was decide they needed to change travel plans. They would meet some physicist at the Physics Center who would invite them to come visit such and such university or laboratory as soon as they left Aspen. So they would want to change from flying to the West Coast to flying to Chicago. And I was busy doing that. They were absolutely delightful people and great scientists. But Larry and I both really did a lot of extra work, and when we took them to the airport and waved goodbye, we were quite relieved. When the Soviets used to come to visit, they would bring two gifts. One was vodka and one was cigarettes. And we enjoyed the vodka, and caviar. They had us over for vodka and caviar. But they gave us a pack, both of us, a pack of cigarettes as a thank you for taking care of them. Well, I stopped smoking in 1969 or 1968, and I only smoked intermittently. And Larry had promised his wife he would never smoke another cigarette. We looked at each other, we looked down at the packs of cigarettes, and we went out behind Beta Hall in the tall grass and sat like a couple of naughty kids, and each had a Russian cigarette. It's one of two cigarettes I've smoked in the last 35 years. The other one was in China. Another committee that I was on was the Community Relations Committee. And we were trying to build better and better community relations. So one of the things that I contributed to that was giving lectures. I love giving popular lectures. I gave a couple of lectures in Flug Forum on special relativity and general relativity. And I think they went over pretty well because I was teaching a course regularly, which is usually dubbed Physics for Poets. And in fact, I had videotaped twice the entire 43 lectures of this course. It's the concepts of modern physics for non-scientists. So I was used to explaining concepts to people who didn't think that they could understand them. And I really had a great time doing those two lectures in the Flug Forum, but probably the highlight lecture was one that was co-sponsored by the Physics Center and the Ski Corporation. We went up to the top of Aspen Mountain, and there's a little sort of circle where people do music performances or have little talks about the mountain. And I stood in the middle of the circle, and I explained the sky. I explained the rainbow. I explained all kinds of things about, the greenhouse effect and the ozone layer, and had all my little props from home. I had mirrors and jars and a hammer to shatter something to mock what clouds do. And that was really a great, great fun lecture. We put my 43 lectures on Grassroots TV, which Nick DeWolf really helped with. And for many years, and it's actually happened to me once this summer, people would say, "Oh, you're the physics lady. Oh, we enjoy your lectures so much." And the time this summer, somebody who was at an event that I was at said, "Still miss your physics lectures." So I felt really good about that. Another thing that we did in community relations was help one of the neighbors, Jim Markelanis, pull thistles. The horse track and the meadows and the physics ground are very susceptible to thistles. They spread fast. They're a really invasive, noxious weed. And Jim is always going out killing thistles. So we really endeared ourselves to that part of the neighborhood by making work parties, providing big, heavy gloves for them, and they would go out and pull thistles. Another non-scientific aspect of the Physics Center in the 60s, when I wasn't here, but certainly in the 70s and into the 80s, was that we did a lot of the physical labor ourselves. I was one of the people who organized work parties. There were work parties to move the library. There were work parties to take all the rocks, after all, it's the Rocky Mountains, off the lawn and pile them over by the street so that we could have a nicer yard out in front of Hilbert Hall. There was a couple from Penn State University, the Brickwettas, and they were both physicists. And Lang Brickwetta, the woman, and Lisa Gelman, the daughter of Murray and Margaret Gelman, and I went up Lincoln Creek Gulch one day to find essentially driftwood, pieces of trees that have been washed in the Roaring Fork River, Lincoln Creek, it was Lincoln Creek, so that they looked like driftwood. And we got sage from the meadows and transplanted it sort of where the bicycle rack is. We had a row of sage and driftwood, which we thought was very artistic. It wasn't very professional, but was very artistic. We needed more furniture in Hilbert Hall and didn't have the money to buy new furniture. So someone found chairs, and I actually asked to sit on one for my interview. This lovely red chair, red wooden chair, was painted sometime back in the 70s by Lang, Brickwetta, and children. She said, "Oh, I'll take charge of painting the chairs and sprucing them up." And she went out and picked out red paint, and she got some brushes and put newspapers down and painted these red chairs. And I'm so happy that there's at least one of them still at the Physics Center, because it's an historic example of the work parties. I'm going to turn to a few more personal and social things. One of the social things is that there have been people in the community who have been so hospitable to the physicists. Nick and Maggie DeWolf used to open their house to the physicists, and it wasn't just to the physicists. They had parties which included all kinds of community people, and they would invite the physicists that they knew, and it was a great place to get to know community people better. Marty Flug opens his house to both music and physics participants on occasion, and it's been another great place to get to know some of the music people better. I actually took piano lessons from one of the music faculty one summer, and that had been one of a couple music faculty I'd gotten to know. And by going to parties at Marty Flug's, the music people and the physics people have gotten to know each other. He's on both boards. Every weekend, we would go out on a family hike and a mountain climb. That was the standard. And one week, Randy asked me if I wanted to try going up Star Peak, which is a difficult, sort of inches short of 14,000-foot peak, which you have to do early in the year because it needs to have a snow cover to make the surface firm so that you don't slip on the rocks so much. You don't slip and slide on the gravel scree slopes. If I wanted to go up Star Peak with Randy and Paul Fishbane and Jeremy Bernstein, and all of them had been climbing and hiking for many years more than I had, and of course I was game to do it. So we went to Star Peak, and one of the first things that we encountered, Jeremy was very triumphant about, and he had been talking about it. It was called El Wallo. It was all El Wallo del Muerte. It was a big, steep, like essentially vertical snow wall, way taller than any of us. And to go up it, you would have really needed serious climbing equipment. But Randy had a little route around the side of it, and we all took that. Partway, and this was near the beginning of the climb, of the hike, and partway around El Wallo, my foot went through the snow, and there was just space, not solid snow, and I hit my leg really hard on a rock. And a year later, I still had remnants of that bruise. But I was not going to let on that I had any kind of a problem. And we got up the scree slope and the big rocks and got to the top of Star Peak. I was really very proud of that, probably the proudest of that mountain of any of the mountains that I learned to go up. I can remember that Heinz Pagels, when we would go out on family hikes and climbs, was more like one of the adolescent boys that were with us in our families than like one of the parents, because Heinz would go out in his shorts and his tennis shoes, the same as some of the kids were wearing, and just had a tremendous amount of stamina and would go right up the mountains with sort of unbelievable energy. On a very personal note, I wanted to say that Randy had bought a lot very near the Physics Center on Pearl Court, which now has 3 physics family houses, the Kauses and the Pineses and the Durands, back in 1964. And when we were married in 1970, we decided that one of the first things we were going to do was build a house on that lot as a place for his 3 sons to come every summer to Aspen, and for us to come so that we would not have to be renting a different house every year. So we built that house starting at the end of 1971, And that actually, I referred to the house we stayed in the first summer as one that was nearby and in really bad shape. And I think by the end of that summer, they were starting to tear that house down just as our house was going up. We've had that house for well over 30 years, and it is, I think, a stable point for our family because everyone, parents, brothers and their wives, nieces and nephews, and the kids, and now their wives and their kids want to come see us in Aspen. They don't want to go see us in Wisconsin. It's so much more fun to come to Aspen. We had to put a one-room, two-story addition on the house when we started having grandchildren because everybody likes to come at Christmas time and ski and in the summertime and do outdoor activities. And I'm really pleased that that's how the kids grew up, and they want to pass it on. The three sons, Randy's three sons, all had summer jobs when they got old enough in Aspen. And the oldest one worked at the Physics Center. It was one of the physics kids, and did handyman work and cleaned the irrigation ditches and took care of things. And one of his jobs was to empty waste baskets. So one evening he came home for supper, and he said, "I finally figured out what it takes to be a really good theoretical physicist." And we said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" And he said, "Well, I go around and I empty the waste baskets, and some are fuller than the others. And I noticed that Mr. Gilman's is really full, and Pop's is really full, and Bernice, yours isn't as full all the time. So, I don't know, I've decided that the best physicists have the fullest waste baskets at the end of the day," which means you're doing calculations with paper and pencil, and you're making mistakes and throwing away the paper. The other two boys did a sequence of jobs, and one of them was babysitting. The middle son, who's now a chef and lives near Aspen, before he started working at restaurants, did babysitting. And one evening, he was hired by the James Bardeen family. The Bardeens are a sort of dynasty of physicists. And Jim Bardeen is in astrophysics. And he had come out with his family, and I believe they were staying out at Snowmass. They had twins who were still in diapers, twin boys who were still in diapers. Well, Tim went out to babysit, and about 2 hours later, we got this call, and he said, "I've run out of diapers. What should I do?" And while he was on the telephone with us, the twins got into the toilet paper and were strewing it all over the house. And maybe that's what made Tim decide that he wanted to be a chef. Another little story about one of the boys, the one who majored in archaeology eventually and became a stuntman. We would turn him loose when he got old enough with David Simmons, the son of Mike and Margaret Simmons, and Nick Gelman, the son of Murray and Margaret Gelman. And the three of them would just go off for the day, maybe taking a sandwich with them. And the only thing we said was, you go hiking, just be back by a certain time, and be sure you don't go in any of the mine shafts on Aspen Mountain. So they would come back, and Chris would take off his backpack, the youngest son, and start pulling out, old bottles or spoons or pieces of mining equipment. And it was really clear that they'd gone into the mine shafts, and our budding archaeologist had found all these things which had been lying there for 80 years and nobody had noticed them, or nobody had thought that they would be great souvenirs. I think the Physics Center has 2 or 3 really big things going for it that are going to make it continue to thrive over many more decades. One, of course, is the fabulous experience you have mixing new and old physicists, mixing people from different fields, this random assignment of offices, the general talk around the picnic tables at lunch. It's really a very exciting professional experience. I think that the fact that you're not at your home institution makes it easier to interact, because at a university, the younger people are being judged by the older people while they're assistant professors, while their postdocs are assistant professors. And when you come here, there isn't going to be somebody who's watching you to see how you do and is then later going to vote on whether you still have a job. So it gives you a sort of freedom. And then finally, I think that everyone loves this place so much and has such a good professional experience that a really extraordinary number of a fraction of the physicists are eager to pitch in and help. And I think that that's one of the things that's going to continue to sustain the Physics Center.